Hello everyone, I am Shaohai Guo. Today I'm going to talk about a pivotal naval battle in the American Revolution known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, also known as the Battle of the Virginia Capes. There are two major significant things regarding this battle. The first is that this naval battle was key in maintaining the French naval blockade at the Siege of Yorktown. Without the blockade, General Cornwallis would have been able to get supplies and reinforcements from the sea. The second significance to this battle is that there doesn't seem to be a consensus from historians on who deserves the credit or blame for the results of the battle. This is surprising because there are tons of primary sources, including letters from Washington to the French commanders and admirals, letters from British admirals to King George, eyewitness accounts, etc. I use many of those sources in my research, which you can find at the end. Now, because commitment to objectivity and honesty is essential to historical investigation, I will begin my analysis discussing the background prior to the battle. Then I will divide credit and blame for the battle into three sections: strategy, tactics, and follow-up action. This is because I view battles as a complex event, and us historians shouldn't generalize credit or blame for the entirety of the battle. So, let's first talk about how this Battle of the Chesapeake was set up. On the British side, things were getting a little bad in 1781. The people in Parliament, members in England, were not at all happy that the war was still going on, especially with France and Spain on the side of the colonies. The failure of Cornwallis's southern campaign due to overestimating the concentration of British loyalists took a toll on the morale of Clinton and Cornwallis's men. By now, the British desired a decisive battle to end the American Revolution. In terms of possible British targets, they had a couple of options. The first was to eliminate the French naval garrison at Rhode Island. The other was to seize the middle colonies and split them north and south. At this time, Cornwallis was retreating from his southern campaigns and approaching the middle colonies. We will see if Britain decides to focus on either target when we go into the strategy section. In terms of Britain's naval situation, Britain had control of much of the coastal area around the colonies, yet they couldn't put all of their naval forces near the colonies due to number one, John Paul Jones's successful victories near British waters, and number two, the proximity of France and Spain. Britain had to reserve some ships in order to protect their own homeland. That is essentially the British background prior to the Battle of the Chesapeake. Things weren't so rosy on the American side either. The major leaders we're going to focus on includes one American general, one French general, and two French admirals. The American general is George Washington. The French general is Comte de Rochambeau. These two land forces at this time were in Newport, Rhode Island. The two French admirals are de Barras and de Grasse. De Barras is the admiral stationed in the French Rhode Island garrison and does not participate in the Battle of the Chesapeake, but will play a factor after the battle. De Grasse is all the way near the Caribbean Sea, trying to collect money to loan out to the Americans. You see, the overall situation for the French and Americans was not good. According to Rochambeau, the Americans were nearing the end of their resources. They were running out of money to pay their soldiers. Without money, they couldn't realistically procure supplies from the countryside, and in the long run, they would have to deal with mass desertion, or taking supplies from their own colonists by force. This is confirmed when Washington's soldiers refused to continue to march to Yorktown in early September until they were paid. So America needed money, or else the revolution would collapse. The situation wasn't rosy for France or Spain either. Both countries vastly improved their navy, but naval maintenance was expensive. Plus, they were loaning their money to the United States, and the war was draining their treasuries by each day. Their tax collecting simply was not as good as England's, and if the war went for too long, it would be disastrous for both France and Spain. So both France and the United States wanted the war to end as quickly as possible. They had their eye on two possible targets: New York, where Clinton's army was, or Virginia, where Cornwallis was. We'll see what they chose relatively soon. Strategy at this point gets a little complicated. Instead of concentrating on either the French garrison at Rhode Island or the Middle Colonies, they effectively tried to do both. Not surprising since Cornwallis and Clinton disliked each other, though Clinton was technically Cornwallis's superior. Also technically, King George wanted British operations to focus on Virginia, which Cornwallis agreed with. Yet there was a fear that Washington and Rochambeau would attack New York, so Cornwallis only had about 7,000 troops when he was ordered to build a naval port in Yorktown next to the Chesapeake Bay. This port would allow faster travel between New York and the Virginia campaign when the port was done, assuming that they finished the port, and that didn't happen. Part of the British fleet had to be stationed in New York in order to protect it from a naval blockade from the French garrison at Newport. At the same time, Britain had to stretch out its navy and weaken its naval superiority because it had to now keep an eye on the Chesapeake Bay. In terms of naval strategy, the British were led by two admirals, Admiral Rodney and Admiral Graves. Rodney's job was to track French Admiral de Grassy's fleet. Rodney was quite an intelligent and great British admiral. Too bad he couldn't participate in the Battle of the Chesapeake. We'll get to his absence later. The other British admiral was Thomas Graves. His job was to intercept a supply convoy from France to Boston. Unfortunately, he couldn't quite do that. At this point, the British expected the French and Americans to attack New York, and they would have been right, if not for Count de Rochambeau. Rochambeau deserves most of the credit for coming up with a strategy that would eventually lead to both the Battle of Chesapeake Bay and the successful siege of Yorktown. Washington wanted to attack New York. Not only was it closer, but since Clinton and Cornwallis were miles away from each other, the French and Americans far outnumbered Clinton's New York garrison. But to undertake a successful siege required a successful naval blockade. Without a blockade, a siege would not work because the British would just transport supplies through the sea. It becomes even more problematic if the British already had ships guarding the coastline, so France and America had to target a location not guarded by the British Navy. Rochambeau accurately predicted that the British would focus their navy outside of New York, rather than in the Chesapeake Bay. So Rochambeau convinced both General Washington and Admiral de Grasse to focus their assault on Yorktown. Washington and Rochambeau were leading the land assault from Newport. De Grasse was leading the sea assault from the Caribbean. De Barras's naval garrison, not tipping off the British too soon, would only leave near the estimated date De Grasse would arrive in the Chesapeake Bay. From now on in this analysis, we'll focus only on naval operations. If you want to learn more about land operations, feel free to study the Battle of Yorktown. The naval strategy worked, partially due to luck. De Grasse's movements tipped off the British of a possible siege somewhere, because British Admiral Rodney's job was monitoring that specific French fleet. Unfortunately for the British, Rodney fell ill, so he had to assign his underling, Admiral Samuel Hood, to take over and sail north to either intercept De Grasse or rendezvous with Admiral Graves. Admiral Rodney left for England. Now, had Rodney been at full health and was in command, America might still be part of Great Britain. Rodney was quite capable and actually would later capture De Grasse's fleet after the Battle of Yorktown. Ironically, Admiral Samuel Hood actually was quicker to the Chesapeake Bay than De Grasse. He didn't locate De Grasse or Admiral Graves, however, and because of the fear that Washington was planning on sieging New York, he continued north to rendezvous with the rest of the British naval fleet outside Long Island. In terms of De Grasse, he was very fortunate to have taken the long way to the Chesapeake Bay, and when he reached his assignment, there was no British ships in the bay outside Yorktown. The French now could blockade Yorktown. The British Navy only realized that Yorktown was going to be blockaded once the northern French fleet began moving towards it. It's at this time that British Admirals Graves and Hood realized they needed to sail to the Chesapeake before the French reached it, or should I say De Barras reached it. However, by the time the British Navy neared the bay, it was already taken. Rochambeau's strategy worked. The battle for the Chesapeake Bay was now at hand. We discussed how Rochambeau's superior strategic thinking allowed France to blockade Yorktown. Now we'll discuss who's to blame for the tactics on why the British couldn't stop the blockade. In the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French fleet was led by de Grasse. De Grasse held defensive position within the bay and was blockading Yorktown. His ships were not in the proper defensive position, however, partially due to the tide and the fact many of his men were ashore. De Grasse had 24 ships with a cumulative total of 1,542 guns. All he needed was a stalemate in this battle so that he could continue his blockade. The British fleet was led by Admiral Graves. Underneath Graves in command was Admiral Hood, who led the ships in the rear. The attacking British fleets had 19 ships and 1,410 guns. The British needed to win this battle and drive the French fleet out of the Chesapeake Bay. Even though the British were outnumbered, they should have had a massive tactical advantage in the beginning. The French were not in position to defend themselves, making them susceptible to an attack from the north. The British Navy was arriving through the north, and if Admiral Graves went in boats ablazing, they would have struck at an angle and would have been able to concentrate firepower to pick off emerging French ships. The numerical advantage would be eliminated, and the British probably would have won. Admiral Hood was in support of such an attack against the unprepared French fleet. However, Graves was a little more cautious. According to Admiral Graves, he wanted to form a line so that all his ships would be able to attack at once, so that he would be able to most effectively utilize his numbers against the main French fleet. This was time-consuming and gave de Grasse enough time to form a defensive line. Not all of the French ships were ready, however, so the French numerical superiority did not mean much for now. The two navies fought each other at a near standstill. I won't blame Graves too much for his choice of tactics here, because past British fleets have been defeated for attacking too hastily without forming a line. However, I will blame Admiral Graves for not effectively communicating his signals to the rest of his ships. Because Admiral Hood and Graves operated under separate signals and that they did not have time to create a consensus on proper military signaling, Admiral Hood's assigned ships stayed in the rear guard and did not fire a single shot during the Battle of the Chesapeake, despite the fact that Graves wanted all of his ships to attack the French. I'm going to also blame Admiral Hood for not taking action. Just because Hood misinterpreted Graves' signal not to attack doesn't excuse Hood for not reading the situation and not attacking the French with his ships. It would be different if Hood was in the vanguard, where there would be a lot of distractions, cannon fire, and screams which could impact tactical thinking. However, Hood was in the rear. His cannons were not firing, his ships were not under duress. He should have known what to do. If Hood had ignored Graves' signals and outflanked French ships, then the stalemate would have ended. The French probably would have lost. But due to Graves miscommunicating his signals and Hood not engaging his ships, the Battle of Chesapeake Bay ended as a stalemate. As time moved past and more French ships became ready to join the action, Graves sounded the retreat, and French Admiral de Grasse still held the bay. For all intents and purposes, the British lost this naval battle. But our analysis of this battle doesn't stop here. Let's talk about what happened afterwards. The British still had several more opportunities to try and drive de Grasse out of Chesapeake Bay. De Barras hadn't arrived to reinforce de Grasse yet, after all. Indeed, this was British Admiral Graves' plan, until he inspected several of his ships and realized that a few of them were damaged by the battle. He wanted to repair his ships before he would launch another attack against de Grasse. British Admiral Hood realized how important it was to eliminate de Grasse before de Barras's reinforcements showed up, so Hood wanted another attack on the French fleet. British Admiral Graves, however, did not attack. By the time his ships were ready, French Admiral de Barras had joined de Grasse within Chesapeake Bay, and their ships now far outnumbered the British. Seeing that it was no longer feasible to defeat the French fleet, Graves and Hood sailed their ships back to New York. I'm going to have to blame Admiral Graves for not following up and trying another attempt to drive the French out. Makes sense why French Admiral de Grasse didn't take initiative to destroy the British fleet, because his main job was to blockade Yorktown. Doesn't make sense for the British to not try again, however. If the blockade at Yorktown succeeded, all Washington and France needed was to outnumber Cornwallis's troops in order to conduct a successful siege. So the reason why the Battle of Chesapeake was important to the American Revolution was that it prevented the British from taking back control of the Chesapeake Bay. Once the bay was in control of the French, Cornwallis's days were numbered. Fortunately for the Americans and French, Admiral Rodney was not part of the Battle of the Chesapeake due to illness. Unfortunately for French Admiral de Grasse, British Admiral Rodney recovered and later captured the French admiral in 1782. Luckily for the Americans, that was after the Battle of Yorktown and only affected the treaties between England and France, and not the treaty between England and America. French Admiral de Grasse was later returned to France and forced into retirement. On the British side, Admiral Graves never got the chance to command another fleet after his failure at taking back Chesapeake Bay. Admiral Samuel Hood, however, was able to recover from the battle and became a full-fledged commander in future British naval conflicts. So that was essentially the Battle of the Chesapeake. It was a key battle which ensured the naval blockade in Yorktown, eventually leading to the end of the American Revolution. In terms of strategy, French General Rochambeau should get the most credit for coming up with the idea to attack Yorktown instead of New York. In terms of tactics, both British Admiral Graves and Hood should be blamed for the British failure. British Admiral Graves should also be blamed for not following up the battle and trying to win back the Chesapeake Bay. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.